Hi there, and welcome to the Play Therapy Circle. Before we begin, please note this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. It does not provide therapeutic advice, and listening does not create a client-therapist relationship. All views expressed are my own, and any case examples shared have been de-identified to protect privacy. If you're seeking personal support, please reach out to a qualified mental health professional in your area. Hi, and welcome to an episode of the Play Therapy Circle. I'm Kylie Ellison, a therapist, clinical supervisor, and play therapy trainer, and I'm so grateful you're here. This podcast is a space for thoughtful, soulful conversations about child-centered therapy, play-based work, and what it means to show up with presence and compassion, both for our clients and for ourselves. Whether you're a seasoned play therapist, a student just starting out, or someone deeply passionate about working with children, you belong here. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Play Therapy Circle podcast. I'm your host Kylie Ellison, and I am so glad you are here. Guys, welcome to episode 10. We're no longer in the single digits anymore, guys. Like, this is a thing. Like, I keep saying to you guys, I've never committed to something so much in a very long time. So if you are still here, 10 episodes down, thank you. I always give a shout out to everyone listening who has supported us. Thank you so much. Guys, not as great at killing it at life this week. I am recording this on Thursday to drop tomorrow. So if that gives you any idea about how my week has gone, but how are you guys doing? How is everyone out there in podcast land? I hope that you are having a good week. Here in Brisbane, we are in the depths now of spring. And finally, this week, it is starting to feel a little bit warmer. I'm coming from Quandamooka country in Brisbane. Quandamooka country is always so incredibly beautiful. And I am so grateful to live and work on this land. And so grateful to our Indigenous elders past, present and emerging, because they are our cohort of clients that we work with and connect with and support every day in the playroom especially. So I am very grateful to be here in Quandamooka country today. And I guess we're moving into school holidays, everyone. So for those parents listening out there, sending love and light. Love and light, because school holidays is not for the faint-hearted. My kids, as you guys know, I've mentioned along the way, they're now 12 and 13. So they're getting a little bit easier, but we're going to sit down on the weekend and organise a schedule. And I say that, and I bring this up, and I'm going way off topic as I normally do, and I really need to keep to a time schedule today because I have other things to do. But I think that something I've been reflecting on with supervisees this week is just the overschedulizing of children, the overschedulizing of us as parents, navigating work, family life, and everything in between. And I just want to give a special shout out to anyone this week who is having a bit of a tough week. I think that what we are seeing in our clinic and in our connections with our families, but certainly more broadly as well, is we are living in somewhat uncertain times. We're living in a world that I think is constantly, obviously, evolving, but challenging on a good day. And so I think sometimes it's really hard to kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. And one of the things I've been doing the last few weeks, which sounds a bit corny, but I extend it to anyone listening if you're having a bit of a rough time, is at nighttime, I have a little notepad where I write three things that I'm grateful for each day. And I think that has just helped to ground me a little bit in some of the more positive aspects of my life when, certainly the content that we are meeting with and holding space for in the playroom each week can be very heavy and very hard. And then obviously the complexities of life, of our families and our communities. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a shout out. I'm not normally this sort of somber to begin our podcast, so apologies. I also need to let you know I'm recording again today. I come on location from my lounge room. We have some big gum trees around our property, and today is the day that the branches have decided to fall on the roof. So if you can hear something in the background, it's nothing to be concerned about. It is just branches falling. Also too, the kids are home, Grant is home, so all of the things. We are doing the juggle. Sending love and light to everyone listening today, and I hope that you are having a good week. And certainly with the weather warming up here in Brisbane, it's some fun times ahead in terms of being able to go to the beach and go swimming and all that good stuff that we've not had for a minute over winter. All right, let me get back on track because that's actually important. What are we going to tackle today? Last week, just to recap, we covered helping children to be able to emotionally express themselves in the playroom in a sense of feeling comfortable and safe and held and having a trusting space to be able to show them a more vulnerable side. And I think that it really fostered a lot of conversations, certainly for me, with colleagues and supervisees around this concept and notion of being authentic and congruent in the playroom. And I feel like it's probably a topic I'm going to go back to again, guys, at some point. As I've said to you guys, I have a list a mile long of topics. So I'm just trying to chip away at them each week with everything that I want to discuss. So I promise I'll circle back to it because I think it's something that is super important in terms of our practice and really understanding how we bring ourselves to the playroom and what impact that has on our clinical work and the clinical outcomes for our children that we work with. Definitely give us a listen if you are interested, but we're pivoting now into more of, and we've started this already, right? But we're kind of moving now into the nuts and bolts of play therapy. So hopefully this is a resource, these upcoming episodes, as part of your learning and development if you're currently a studying play therapist, or in fact you're a seasoned one and want to revise. This is hopefully a good prompt for that, because today I want to talk about tracking and reflecting content in the playroom. So we're going to start talking about these therapeutic techniques and really kind of core skills of CCPT. So what are we going to cover in terms of the content? I want to talk a little bit about the definitions of tracking and reflecting content, what that looks like, and hopefully provide some examples around that. I want to talk a little bit about considerations for practice. There's certainly some populations of kids that we work with where we need to be mindful of that tracking and how we're doing it, and certainly some of those pitfalls and how to recover. I'm definitely keen to unpack some of this content, so let's get started. I want to start off with the topic of tracking and the skill of tracking. When I'm explaining it to students, I often explain it as really, in my view, and again, guys, just acknowledging, I feel like I am still a learning play therapist 10 years up down the line. I've still got lots and lots of years to go. But in the way that I've conceptualized it is really looking at tracking as that foundational skill in child-centered play therapy. I really like to, when I'm teaching this, to focus on this skill first, in the sense that if we can get this skill right, or not even right, guys, because I want to give you all that permission that we are constantly learning, but we need to feel a sense of confidence enough to be able to try it and do it in the playroom before we then take on a next level of skill in CCPT. So I really look at tracking as being that first skill, that foundational skill. So it's very much, I often kind of caveat it too to say it feels a little bit clunky. It feels a little bit unnatural when I'm sharing this in a teaching space. And I'll often say if it feels uncomfortable or it doesn't feel like normal or the way you'd normally talk, then that's great, because that means you're learning something new. When things feel uncomfortable and different and unique and out of our normal range of skills, we're learning something new. So I want to give that permission to anyone who is struggling a little bit to start those skills. What I always say is this is a skill tracking. We're not doing deep therapeutic content. It is a way of communicating and connecting with children that you can use across settings. So I always encourage trainees and supervisees to practice this in real time. Track people in your life, track your dog. Like, it's one of those things where we can follow someone along, and that's essentially the intention of the skill, is to show that we're following on, that we are showing our genuine interest, and that we care, and that we are here to be present with that person or that dog. So I want to give you guys that permission, because we talked about permissiveness a few episodes ago, right? And that permissive space we offer in child-centered play therapy. But I think that it's very important that you have the opportunity to practice this and get a good handle on it so you can then build on those skills. So what does tracking look like in real time? One of the ways that I share, and I know that this is part of Gary Landra's teachings as well, in his textbook, The Art of the Relationship. But starting off with you or you are as the beginnings of your statement is really helpful. Why do we say that? Because as we understand it in child-centered play therapy, it's very much about the journey of the child. That is very much the focus of our intervention and the space that we hold in the CCPT playroom. So it's not about us. And I say that a lot to students because I'm like, okay, we can get bogged down in some of our own questions, our own wonderings, and certainly as we go through the podcast episodes, we'll unpack that. But I think for the purposes of tracking, we don't start those statements with I think you just knocked that over. We're not using that language. We're starting off with you or you are. You knocked that one over, because what we want to do is put the child in the lead. We want to put them front and center of the focus of the content and the therapeutic work in that session. And so we're removing us in that space when we're doing tracking. Definitely starting with you or you are, you're lining the blocks along there, you've put that one over there, you've picked that one up. They're very general kind of reflections that I offer to you. It very much has multifunctions. So as somebody who's deeply passionate about CCPT and getting CCPT out into the world, which is part of the reason why I'm doing this podcast, so I can reach more folk to connect in the CCPT space. But one of the other reasons is because I think that it has become for me part of my everyday communication skill with children and with adults. So I'm sure she won't mind me saying this. I was talking to one of my colleagues recently and realized when they were sharing something about themselves that in fact I had tracked and reflected feelings for them without even realizing. It wasn't until this person pointed it out to me and I was like, oh my God, I do it all the time. So if it becomes part of your everyday, I'm proud of you. And it also means that you have incorporated it into your practice. So feel free to do that, to start including you or you are in some of those reflecting statements. But the functions of it really are around actually using it as a communication tool. It helps with co-regulation. Because if we are able to track and follow along the play in a warm, connected, non-judgmental, observational way, it invites that permissive space, it invites that supportive space, and children then feel that sense of connection with us. They don't notice exactly what we're saying, and I make a point of pointing that out when I'm sharing this information too, because I think that beginning play therapists can feel very conscious of making sure you say the right things. And I really want to emphasize for anyone listening I feel that shows that you are deeply connected to the work, you're deeply passionate about the work and want to do a good job. So I love everything about that reflection because I think that means there's so much heart in what you're doing. I want to give you permission, though, to take that pressure off. One of the things that I felt I learnt in this approach and in the years since is really an understanding that we don't have to have the answers and we don't need to be the experts in the space, which is incredibly freeing as a therapist when we don't feel like we have to be ready to respond, which I think is one of the reasons I've connected so deeply to this approach. So with that in mind, if we have a go at tracking and the other skills and we struggle or we don't quite get it right, here's the great thing about CCPT. The children will correct you. So if you say something and you think, oh, I'm not sure if that's going to land, or I'm not sure if I'm quite right with that, or if I'm not sure that that's following the protocol, have a go and see the response from the child, because that gives us so much input into what we're doing. You've also got clinical supervision, you've got those supports in place, extra training. You can do other things as well to obviously enhance your skills. But I think if you're nervous about doing that in the playroom, I want to give that permission that it is so much around that connection and authenticity. But it certainly encourages the child to expand their play when they feel like we're tracking along. When we're talking about reflecting content, I kind of talk about that being the next skill in what we learn around CCPT and connecting in the playroom. So we might do more around, it's more kind of a summary is probably the easiest way to describe it. When we're reflecting content, we're following the play and then giving, I guess, a summary statement of what the child has done. So we might be watching them build some blocks, and then they might put, and this is completely a innocuous example, guys, this isn't based on any clients, but just as an idea, you might have a child who build some blocks and they build a house and they put a car in it and they might put some people in it. And so you could then reflect, reminding you guys, you start with you or you are to start that statement for tracking and reflecting content. We would say something like, you've built that just the way you wanted it. You've put all of those things together and it looks just the way you needed it to be. So we're reflecting, I guess, not just you put that one there and then you put that one in there and then you put some of those in there. That would be tracking. We extend that to summarize it. So we actually just watch and at the end kind of summarize that to give the child an understanding that we follow along what they're doing. So those tracking and reflecting reflecting content is super important. When we're talking about tracking, I just want to unpack this a little bit more in terms of how we implement it as well to build on the information I've just shared. One of the most important parts of tracking is not to overdo it. So that can be something, and again, Gary Landreth in his textbook talks about this too, about potentially doing it too much and following along too closely. And so one of the things that I'm reminded of in terms of our core values and our core intentions in CCPT is very much our objectivity and our, as I always say, information gathering and hypothesis testing every session. So what that means is we're constantly taking in that information from the play of the child before we're doing some of that tracking. Now, tracking is a little bit less robust, I guess, in terms of needing that evaluation before you provide that statement. So we do have that permission to follow along and do some of those statements along the way without needing to look at it too deeply. But I would certainly suggest in terms of an approach, trying with the tracking to observe, have a go at tracking. So you put that one over there. You're opening that one now. And then pause and just take in what might be the response. And we were talking about in previous episodes about verbal and non-verbal communication. This is the great thing about tracking, right? Is that we don't need to have input necessarily back from the child to feel like we're on the right track. And in fact, it's usually the non-verbals I find that gives me that confirmation. So it might just be that the child gives you direct eye contact when they haven't given you eye contact for 10 minutes. And that says to me, oof, I've tracked that correctly. I got that, because they don't necessarily say, yeah, that's right. They'll just do it, say, non-verbally with their eye contact or their non-verbal facial expressions. So keeping an eye on the response and the output is really helpful. Keeping them short, guys, concrete, short, succinct, for those statements of tracking is very important. For our littlies, keep it even shorter. Yeah, because if you're trying to track a 2-year-old, because obviously we work in that space of say 2 to 12-year-olds traditionally in CCPT, or 2 to 10s, we might be tracking a 2-year-old who has done 5 different activities in about a minute. So we are tracking for our lives. So make sure that you are doing it short so that you can keep following along. A reminder, guys, with tracking as well, we've got to remove that praise. Not going to say things like, good job, well done, especially for our 2-year-olds. I know it's hard, but we need to really kind of remove that evaluation or that praise responses or questions. We're going to talk about that in a minute too. Let's talk about reflecting content. What does it look like? As I said earlier, it's really around reflecting or summarizing what the child is telling us. And some of those examples can be, yep, you've just let me know. Yep, you've shared with me what you need to. You have put that together just the way you wanted it. You are working really hard right now to make that come together, or you're working really hard to make that work. So I think that making some of those statements can really affirm that you are following along and that you do. That was my husband sneezing. Love that for me. That we are following along and summarizing and understand what the child is trying to tell us. So what's really important is sometimes that we may need to consider, I guess, some of those practice approaches in terms of tracking and reflecting content. I want to do a separate podcast, guys, on reflecting feelings, because I feel like that's a whole topic all on its own. But for tracking and reflecting content, it's really important that we are having cultural and neurodiversity affirming practices, because that that is lenses in our playroom that are super, super important. So we're making sure that we are showing that respect with our language. So these are just some of those considerations, right? So respect with our language. So we're mirroring the child's preferred terms. That's really important. And especially for our neurodiverse children, avoiding pathologizing either stimming or special interests. And I do see this as definitely a beginning play therapist pitfall, where we can meet the diagnosis of the child in the playroom, but not the personhood of the child. So that again is another topic that we will talk about in terms of supporting our neurodivergent children, which I'm absolutely incredibly passionate about and can't wait to share in that episode. So I won't go into that now, but I really want to encourage you guys, if you are connecting with children who maybe, and I really don't like to say this because I don't think this exists, but in terms of normal play versus, say, children who have, say, an autistic diagnosis, who we then meet in the playroom, who may not present as other kids necessarily do. I don't even like saying that, because ultimately at the end of the day, it's about the personhood. It's not just their diagnosis. But if we're presented with engagement in play that we're not so familiar with, it's very important that we're not pathologizing that. And I think that can be something when we feel out of our comfort zone, or as the research says, in times of stress, we revert back to what we know. If we feel like we need to lean into some of that more clinical approach because we have encountered something in the playroom that's new for us, it's actually really important that we stop and not necessarily do that straight up. That we actually take note of the child in front of us as opposed to just that diagnosis. And so making sure that we are using language that makes sense for us and for them. And certainly in that space, and I have an incredible client example I'm sure we will get to when we connect in that neurodiversity podcast. But, a client that I'm working with that I'm really proud of, where language that connects for that client as opposed to what we would traditionally use in CCPT is very important. So I'm definitely keen to talk about that, but making sure that we are following our protocol of CCPT in terms of that tracking, and not necessarily feeling we can't use that skill, or kind of withdrawing or stopping that tracking just because of that particular presentation, whatever that looks like. Being really mindful of that, certainly respectful in our language though, especially in consideration of cultural practices. So sensory considerations, it's very important that we are mindful of our vocal intensity, keeping that calm, empathetic, accepting, congruent language is super, super important. Allow for movement. That's actually really important in having neurodiversity affirming practices. We need to make sure that we are allowing that space for our children to explore and express themselves. And we may want to actually, and I love this idea, there's so many ideas I want to share in our upcoming podcast, but tracking sensory strategies that the child might use might be an example of how we follow the lead of the child and the personhood of the child that we meet. Super important. So some of those practice considerations are definitely important. What are some of the pitfalls? I've talked already a little bit about that, but let me expand on that a little bit more. One of the key things that I see happening that often comes up in beginning play therapist work is the question trap. So if we feel, I take a deep breath, right? I'm regulating. If we feel like, and I just want to give that respect and empathy and unconditional positive regard to all of you listening and all of you in the beginning trenches of your learnings of CCPT. It is very normal for us in times of stress to revert back to what we know, which is often directive and is often questions-based. So if we are asking questions, I want to pose that to you. You're starting off this conversation by talking about how tracking is very much around the child's work and the child's journey and putting them in the lead. As soon as we ask a question, we then become in the lead. So when we think about our tenets of CCPT, our values in CCPT, it doesn't align. So it's very important if we feel like we start, because again, right, I'm going to align this hopefully in another way that makes sense. When we see children in the playroom who ask a lot of questions very often in our analysis of the play, it relates to some sense of anxiety, whether that's separation anxiety, that's anxiety about being in a new space with us, anxiety about meeting a new person, whatever that looks like, right? And we will often tailor our approach, not going outside of CCPT protocol, but certainly recognizing for those kids who are asking a lot of questions that they feel out of their depth, they feel out of their scope, and they feel like they are struggling. And as a way of gaining a bit more control, because we talk a lot about how anxiety can often be representative of that external locus of control, that is very similar, because we work with children of all ages, is very similar for our beginning play therapists and those who may lean into questions in their practice. I want to pose the question to you. Are you feeling anxious or out of your depth when those questions emerge? Putting it out there for you guys to consider, because quite possibly that's the case. So if you notice that you're going into those questions, take a minute and stop, ground yourself in the space, really go to the feelings of what's coming up for you and what's happening for the child to then provide your response. Because I think that sometimes we can get too much in our heads and then we can feel really stressed or really anxious, and then we kind of step outside of our protocols. So it's very important, if you ask, make it choice-based, so we're not investigating. So if there is a situation where we fall into that trap, being able to recalibrate and go back to that tracking using you or you are is very important. Certainly when we're tracking, if you have a situation where it falls short, or you feel like it hasn't really landed, or you feel like maybe you've said something but you haven't said enough, again, one of those antidotes or answers to that problem is to go to the feelings. So we will talk next week about reflecting feelings, but certainly it's very important that we are connecting with kids in a way that they feel safe and feel held and heard, and that certainly is communicated through that reflecting feelings, if nothing else. So I think that in closing this, because again, I'm really mindful of time, I'm trying to keep this short, you guys. We're going on 30 minutes. I really just wanted to touch on tracking and reflecting content, because they are certainly those beginning basic CCPT skills that we establish our practice with. So my recommendation for all of you listening, if you're beginning in this work and you're learning about this approach and you want to incorporate it into your practice, is have a go and make sure that you are, as the takeaways I just want to share, you're starting with you or you are, you're following along, you're observing before you reflect, you're pausing then to kind of see what that sort of response from the child may be. If you don't get a response, that's actually great too, because that means that you're on track and you've been following along, and it's actually what the child is telling you. And in fact, they don't need to, in their work, give you a confirmation. So it's so much about us adjusting as therapists to no longer sometimes getting that output to us where we feel like we've got that confirmation of our skills and abilities. It's really about the child's journey and the child's work and the child's experience, and we are there to observe. So keep that in mind when you're doing that tracking. It's not about intervening. It's not about asking questions. It's not about directing the play. It's not about confirming what they're doing. It really is observing and giving those reflective statements to say, yep, I see what you're doing. And that is super, super important. So try that in your everyday life. Try it tracking your kids, try it tracking your neighbors, try and track the person at the shopping center. I really don't mind. It's wherever you can find a situation where you might be able to just follow along and see how that goes. It's really important that we are certainly keeping the child in the lead and empowering them along the way. So I just want to genuinely and sincerely thank you for listening. This has, as I said, been a succinct podcast because I really want to, and there goes my husband again coughing, and he knew I was recording. I love this for me. I want to give you guys those takeaways of trying that tracking and reflecting content. And as I said, next week we will expand on that next skill of reflecting feelings. Wherever you are in the world today, thank you for listening. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you have a lovely week ahead. I am so grateful to each of you for being here and for following along and supporting, and go well, and I will see you again soon. Thanks. Bye. Thank you so much for being here for another episode of the Play Therapy Circle. If anything resonated with you today, I'd love it if you could follow the podcast, share it with a colleague, or leave a short review. It really helps others find our circle. And if you have a topic or question you'd love me to explore, I'd love to hear from you. This space is for you, and I want it to feel like a conversation. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, you belong here.